All right, recording. Rune, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for allowing me on the podcast.
Oh, very welcome. I mean, you and the podcast share a name, so that's a first.
Yeah.
Nice one. Well, Rune, it is your first time on the show, which means you get the first time question, and I think it's going to be a good one. But were you a weird kid?
Well, maybe the fact that I'm hesitating. I'm not sure I was. Yeah, maybe a little bit, But I wasn't like, for instance, antisocial or something like that. I mean, I didn't like football, and I felt a little bit weird for that. But I also think that I belong perhaps a little bit to the generation where football and mopeds were kind of exchanged for martial arts and role-playing games.
Oh yeah.
Like that. So
yeah, fair enough. I didn't enjoy it either, and I guess that is a weird thing. It can feel kind of isolating when you're a kid. Like, why does everyone like this? What am I not getting here?
Yeah.
So fair enough. So nothing. You didn't grow up on a haunted houseboat somewhere or anything like that.
No.
All right. So how do you? Yeah. What was it? How do you get from a childhood of comparative normality to studying what you study? Did you grow up being interested in this sort of folklore and indigeneity and that kind of thing, or did you find it somewhere?
I think I grew up being interested in those kind of things. I mean, I grew up in the countryside, and I grew up like very much like, playing in the forest and stuff like that. And also I come from a family background that's, well, actually relatively secular. Most Danish people, I'm Danish, they're relatively secular. But the religious background that my family do have is in a specific part of a specific kind of Danish Christianity, which is actually very focused on pre-Christian religion. And that sounds a little bit weird, and I guess it is a little bit weird. There's a couple of things about Danish Christianity that are super weird, but I guess one of them is that you will have, like, for instance, an important psalm writer claiming to be 100% Christian and 90% heathen. Like, and stuff like that, so and that particular kind of Christianity was very much the family background that I came from, and that also means that I got Nordic mythology from my rather religious grandparents rather than actually Bible stories. Or rather religious. I mean, I guess our grandparents were all kind of.
They all went to church, at least.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
yeah.
that kind of people.
Right.
But then it was Nordic myth that they gave me.
So how does that play out? Like, how does that operationally play out if it's a variant of a Danish variant of Christianity that is, I guess, aware of where it's situated? So is there, like, do the churches look, are they designed in a different way or anything like that? Or is it more people, or more interestingly, I think, and this is a two-part question, do they allocate a certain reality to Nordic mythological stories that other Christianities wouldn't, because officially, it's all erroneous heathen nonsense, and Christ is the light. So did they have a different, were they aware it was a kind of true thing, even if they identified as Christians?
Well, I think to some extent it was a ritual thing. I mean, sometimes they would sacrifice people in bogs and hang them in trees. That was a joke.
Sure. Yeah.
No.
When my grandfather took me to my first sacrifice,
we did it in Sunday school. Yes, there is a different ascription of religious validity, I would say, but not in the kind of Thor and Odin and Loki exists way that much. the idea in this kind of Christianity, it's called Grundtvigianism, and that is they actually thought about the Edda as the Old Testament of Northern Europe. So they so they had this idea that the Elder Edda and also the Prose Edda, the Icelandic writings, were in fact the Old Testament. So that means that they, or at least certain generations of these kind of Christians, they really jumped over their own shadow to find prophecies or foretellings of the coming of Christ in the Nordic material. So, for instance, the myth of Balder, who is this very innocent sort of figure, and him being killed, that was sort of perhaps seen as a reflection of the coming of Christ and so on. So in that sense, they did look at it. But this was also a rather actually nationalist kind of Christianity. But then we also get into the weird conundrum of North European nationalisms. But so it was thought about also as a cultural thing, I think. And paradoxically, exactly this kind of Christianity has today, I think it has a leftist leaning. Actually, it's quite inclusive. Actually, it's anyway. It's a weird thing because it's quite
cool. Yeah.
It's quite folkish actually, but it's leftist and very inclusive. So it kind of it probably crosses international ideas of those things a little bit. I'm not focused, by the way. Now I'm just talking about this Christianity.
Yeah.
Particular kind of Christianity is put together.
I like that. That's possibly the most Christian thing about it, is considering the Eddas like the Old Testament, because very early Christianity literally did that with the Old Testament. It went back through it, looking for typological similarities they could consider to be foreshadowings of Christ. And you see people in the Renaissance doing something similar with classical Greek thought. So that's interesting. That's like technically the most Christian thing about it is looking for the typology of Christ. Fascinating. Yeah. All right. So that means your grandparents, or your grandfather at least, gave you maybe your first introduction to Norse mythology and so on, or was it elsewhere in the air and you think, okay, I'm into this, I'm gonna keep pulling on that thread? Was it a love at first sight thing?
Yeah, I think so. I was fascinated by this from the beginning. It was my grandmother, by the way, who mostly read these stories to me, and also quite early on, I sort of felt, or I remember feeling that this had something to teach us, that this had something to give us somehow. However, when you're a child and you are reflecting on these things, of course, you're also in a sense very subject to the common perceptions in your culture, and that means that for instance, the idea, I remember thinking that the idea of gods was weird somehow, that there was something almost pastiche-like about these all too human characters with their magic weapons and their animal companions and their weirdly human kind of faults of character and all that stuff. It seemed like this weird pastiche-like kind of gallery to me when I was a kid, and it didn't seem to comply with the notions that are sort of sub-communicated in culture about what divinity, for instance, is supposed to be like. But this is.
I really resonate with that. Encountering pagan mythologies as a kid, I couldn't locate how, and it turns out, and I spent a lot of time with this, but I couldn't locate why anyone ever thought that was real, and it was because of how it had been communicated through the times. And funnily enough, we can let the Christians off the hook, because at least they considered pagan cosmologies some kind of real. What typically happens is by the time you're reading it in like regional Australia in the 80s, it's actually come through materialist naturalism. It's actually come through the idea that any kind of immanence in the universe is bullshit. And that's what the prestige thing for me. I know exactly what you mean. It's like, this is not even as good as the daytime soaps that, or the afternoon soaps I watch when I get back. How did this, like, how did a civilization form around this for 2,000 years? Really interesting, huh? I resonate with that a lot.
Yeah. I think also there's something about the our modern or rationalist sort of ideas about what is an imaging of reality supposed to be like. And I don't think that pre-Christian or let's say polytheist mythologies align very much with that. Like very big part of my understanding of this comes from my studies of Afro-Brazilian primarily practices and ideas. And when you look at that, you find that there are wildly contradictory ideas about, for instance, a question as simple as what is a god? You know, a god can be a force of nature. It can be a dead pre-colonial Yoruba king. It can be a father that protects you. It can be a Catholic saint. It can be an abstract symbol of Black empowerment. It can be a husband in initiation. It can be a rapist that takes you in possession. It can be a child that you enculturate, you form it into become a culturally functional itself almost through ritual, right? Now, all these images, they are so contradictory. They're so contradictory. But the point is not that they shouldn't be contradictory. Their point is not that they should work together like cogwheels in an old-fashioned clock. That's not the purpose. The purpose of all these rather contradictory imagery is tied in specific ritual relation makings. So, for instance, the idea of a deity as a Catholic saint, well, that enables specific ritual relating where you actually appropriate Catholic imagery into ways of then creating space for this polytheist religion. The image of it as a pre-colonial Yoruba king, it does something else. The image of it as a father does something, and the image of it as a child does something else. These two images are contradictory, right? So, and I think that when we look at, for instance, Nordic mythology, then first it has already been almost sort of aligned into literary narration by the work primarily of Snorri, that sort of created this coherent story of it. So it actually, a lot of people who looks at Nordic mythology, I have a feeling they want to make things look systemic. They want to make things fit together so everything fits together. They should do the opposite.
Yes,
absolutely. It needs to be, it actually needs to be more contradictory, less consistent. That would be moving towards the actual polytheist way of perceiving it. And that's, and we come, when we look at it, we come from that idea. Okay, so it needs to be this sort of cultural machinery that sort of, where everything sort of works together and speaks, every motive speaks to each other and stuff like that. And that's, I think that's also part of why it comes to be so weird, to appear so weirdly prestige to us. Thor as a red-bearded brawling man with a hammer that if you have this sort of Yoruba perspective on a deity such as this, that could be one image that would do something particular. Another image could be as a function related to kingship in specific areas. There are, taking Thor as an example, there's a lot of runestone inscriptions that have the words Thor Riki or Thor Viki, Thor sanctify, as if Thor is actually sanctifying the runes. We would expect Odin to be the one sanctifying the runes, but perhaps in Sweden and Denmark, where these stones are found, Thor had that function, because things aren't consistent, and we should think them towards being less consistent if we want to actually understand these kind of, or rather, we should think their consistency in relation to ritual action.
Yes, absolutely. The universal is in the contact event, is in the actual embodied performance of it. That's the universal. The flow on out of it varies, because the things that are in relation in ritual are different each time it happens. Yeah. Now, I mean, I think that's clearly the case with the Greeks as well. And their cosmology went for so long that they did attempt a couple of times to clean it up and make it coherent, but it's never meant to be that. It's they exist in a universe that's alive as tales of contact, and it's that contact that is the thing, right? Like, that's the reality of it. Did you have any experiences like that before you decided to move in a professional direction, looking into these things? So there's the grandmother telling you the stories and experiencing them in some way as a pastiche, but you're also a kid in the woods. Was there ever a point where you're like, did those two things relate prior to you moving in like an academic historian direction? Did you think, hang on a minute, like I'm experiencing a living cosmos and I have these stories, something must click here?
Yeah, I had I don't remember having many like very intense religious experiences as a child. I remember having some, but not like a lot. But I did have like an ongoing, very strong craving for the like very strong drive for there to be that sort of connection. Uh, and I was working with that in different ways. So, like for instance, I spontaneously started giving offerings to different spirits, stuff like that, as a quite young child. So yeah, so in that way, yeah, definitely. And I would say that the academic sort of framework that I'm working from now. Now that makes a flip of a lot of sense, but because new animist theory and this whole complex of thinking, sometimes called ontological turn and so on, these are ways of thinking that it's almost as if you have Occidental thinking turning back in on itself, or kind of saying, maybe it was Yanomamo Amazonians that were right and we were kind of wrong. There is a spirit in the tree. It was just our understanding of subjectivity that was a little bit too primitive. It wasn't them that were primitive, it was us.
The beauty, I can see that in your work. We were talking about the book that I just finished beforehand. The tremendous, and I'll get your definition of it, but the exciting and potent and electric thing about the term animism is that Europeans invented it to talk about the naive, childlike mind of brown people. But it was us in the end that had the faulty theory of mind. And it's this kind of, it's almost, speaking of pastiche, like it's almost on the nose that it turns out that this is, out of all the European disciplines, the one that is arguably the most racist is the one where we find like the limits of our wrongness. And I think there's a poetry to it that is cosmic.
Yeah, there's a negation. There's a negation going on there that in the term that is really a deep denigration of the other. It is following that thread that we actually transgress exactly those limitations that are put by this dimension. Yeah.
All right.
I don't know if that makes sense. Made sense.
Oh no, I'm all into it. Don't you? Like, that's exactly where my head's at. But for people who maybe aren't there with us yet, Rune, what is animism, and how did we get the term? And you can answer that one way or the other. You can start with the term and describe it, or you can do it the other way around.
Okay. We got the term animism from one of the founders of anthropology, was called Edward Bernard Tyler, who was this like 19th century Victorian British anthropologist who were sitting with his long beard in his library and writing stuff about Aboriginal Australians and all kinds of people that he never even, even intended to be close to or actually try to understand. But he had this idea. He also actually championed the idea of cultural evolutionism, that cultures are on a progressively rising trajectory from being primitive and savage and all those things to become civilized and enlightened and all those things. And his own culture, 19th century English culture, was at the top of that hierarchy, and what we would today call indigenous cultures were at the bottom of that hierarchy. And this rising through the hierarchy was also characterized by changes in religiosity. That different modalities of religion would then lead us towards the most enlightened position, which was then rejecting religion altogether, becoming rationalist, or maybe having an extremely abstract idea of a distant god or something like that. Right. So animism, he understood animism as the foundational childlike idea that, and he sort of speculated that perhaps it arises from dreams, that we experience dreams, and then that everything is sort of permeated by spirit as a sort of ethereal white smoke kind of thing. and that was sort of his, and that everything would be animate. He considered a childlike.
It's so important. It's so important that like brown races were simplistic like children. And so they couldn't understand really the difference between dreams and the waking world, and they thought dreams were some kind of real. And of course 19th century Englishmen know that dreams aren't real. Like, this is the irony, is like, leaving aside the racism, like we were the wrong ones.
Totally.
But it's really important for this sort of progress model, and also to see it like he saw it like geology or like Darwin's theory of evolution. And it was a big change to how Europe understood religion, because most people thought of religion as declining from a golden age. And in the 19th century, we're like, well, no, we'll do it like Darwin, and everything's going from simplistic and primitive to white and wearing waistcoats.
Exactly. And how awesome it would be if we were all Victorians.
Well, it's so important, because that was a big part. That's like the white man's burden. So it's not just science, it's science that is invented to justify why it is why I'm speaking English in Australia. Like there's they're children who need our help to turn into us. Like it's a really dangerous age. It's not just racist, it's dangerous,
Totally. And I mean, all these things were put into action. I mean, when we talk about Bernard Tyler, another thing that we should just remember is that he was, in his own time, I think he was actually, just at some level, progressive. He was involved in like societies that were like the Society for the Protection of the Natives, which of course is super patronizing in its own way. However, it should also be seen at the backdrop of people saying that darker races basically weren't human beings. So
they thought they were children. Yes, it has that techno-solutionist, materialist interventionism. They are morally obliged to intervene, and that's very dangerous. That's always dangerous.
And he also had this programmatic statement somewhere in the end of his important treaty, where he said, I don't remember the exact words, like, it is the harsh and at times even painful office of ethnography to be something like a reformer's science, to mark out those part of crude old culture that has turned into harmful superstition and mark them out for destruction. It's like, I mean, that is a pretty radical thing to say. If you're a cultural scholar, you're actually about to go out, look at human culture and say, okay, no, that should be destroyed. It's a very extreme position to take. Yeah. But I think part of what is interesting looking at this from today's perspective on, for instance, what animism is, has to do with this ascription of childishness to the non-white other, because there is a sense in which children do have animist perceptions. A child would say naughty chair if it hits itself on a chair, thereby ascribing intention to the chair. However, that might be sort of animist inflected. The child has not yet been acculturated into modernity and learned that it's not supposed to think about the child, the chair as subjective. However, going from there to saying that animism is necessarily childish, that is just a huge mistake. Animist communities who have animist knowledge forms, these communities, these animist knowledge forms are super advanced. They are practiced at technologically very, very high levels, and it is typically elders who master it most. It's not children, so calling it childish is downright wrong. Yeah, you could say that there is a kind of an animism in the child saying naughty chair, but it's a little bit like saying, yeah, there's also astronomy in the child saying there's 100 kilometers to the stars.
But also, I don't give the term animist to anyone who doesn't want it. But let's say indigenous children are the same. Like an Aboriginal kid's going to say naughty chair as well, and then they're going to grow out of it, like our kids do.
Yeah.
And they're still going to be in a. It's and so.
Or they'll be taught to handle that epistemology. They'll be taught to use that epistemology, perhaps in a better way or a more functional way.
Yeah, well, when a kid says naughty chair, it's he or she is trying to work out his own agency, like rather than chair. Particularly, like there's the shame of tripping over something or whatever, and that can't exist in reality. So the chair must have there's the child mind and whatever. But coming back to the framework, so animism is like the base of human cosmologies, according to Tyler, and then we progress into more sophisticated ones, moving into polytheism and then monotheism and then nothing. So animism is the worst. Animism is the most basic.
Yeah, and then I think that what we spoke about before, so exciting that happens in 20th century. It's been called a slow revolution in anthropology because it sort of snuck up on us. People didn't notice that all of a sudden we were becoming animist. It's as if we became animist without, it wasn't bassooned very loudly. And I think that's probably the only thing it could happen. If it had been bassooned, it would have faced some very harsh gatekeeping functions, I think, in our culture. But since, I mean, with Irving Howe, it is as if he doesn't really himself sort of realize how radical it is what he's doing. But it's just, or maybe it's also part of retrospectively that people are almost attributing this birth of new animist thinking to him more than if things had developed in a different way, he probably wouldn't have been remembered for doing it. But still, like what he actually does, like in the mid 20th century, going and saying, well, actually, Ojibwe thinking about the world should be viewed horizontally as a fully valid philosophy of the world. That was probably really pretty radical in those days. And,
definitely. And I think it's right to say that because he was doing it, he wouldn't have been able to articulate it, and I think that has happened to the academy as well. It's this sneaking animism, because there's hints at it. Like Hallowell is I think official beginning of the animization of the Western Academy, but there are hints beforehand. Like when Jung was amongst the like Turtle Island First Nations, And again, and in Africa as well, and it's still he still uses terms like the Negroes and whatever, because it's like the 30s, you know. But you can see in Jung, particularly I think in America, a realization that the theory of mind that he's experiencing with the First Nations is kind of something like it's not pathological. It's something that it's not the same as his, but like he can understand it. He's like, there's a reality to this that isn't just something we should dismiss. But Hallowell, I mean, for people who don't know, tell the Hallowell and Ojibwe story, because it was an electrifying moment in anthropology, and well, subsequently electrifying. It was a brave moment in anthropology.
Yeah, Hallowell, Irving Howe was an American anthropologist, if I remember correctly, and he went and stayed with First Nations people at that point called the Ojibwe, and I'm actually not 100% sure if that's the right way to call them today. Perhaps the right word would be Anishinaabe. Anyway, he went and stayed with them, and he took his starting point in looking at their language, where he discovered that certain things there were grammatical categories that classified certain things as animate and certain things as non-animate, and the things that were classified as animate would not align with what the Eurocentric Western mind would classify as animate. For instance, stones are animate in Ojibwe perception. And he then, I think he was the one who launched the idea of other than human persons, and started taking this idea seriously. Are there subjectivity in the stones somehow? And really talking about these people. So that's Irving Howe. Yeah. He wrote an important work about Ojibwe worldview.
And that's really, it's because of that. I mean, I know you do too. We typically use Graham Harvey's kind of like, this will do for a definition of animism, but it does hinge on basically how populated you think the universe is, right? Like it's how many persons there are, and you can't not have a person theory, and this is quite important. So Hallowell arrived amongst the Ojibwe with a person theory, which is that humans equal persons, and those are the only persons. So that it's not that say the Ojibwe or the Avalaruna or whoever have like, oh, that's a bit odd, they think other people are persons. It's like, no, if you're alive on planet Earth, you have a personhood theory. You can't not, right? So it's and Hallowell was quite good at that. It's like, well, hang on, why not? You know, it's not that they're doing something different from the normal, it's that there are other theories of personhood and experiential theories of personhood, because that's the crucial part. Like literally you cannot, because you have a sense of self, you cannot not have a personhood theory with which you use to move about the world, right? And it just so happens that you know, thanks to Descartes and a few others, Europe had, like, for 300 years there, the worst and stupidest possible one, which is that humans are the only persons. And that's the crucial, like, coming into the definition of animism. Do you want to give us the Graham Harvey version? We'll do that.
Yeah, Graham Harvey. I also, you know, for listeners out there, hello. I think his work is very much to be recommended, because he writes so lucidly and so understandably. I mean, you don't need to be a scholar really to read what he writes, and he is one of the most important scholars of animism today. Now, his definition of animism, if I remember it correctly, is that there are persons in the world, only some of whom are human, but all of whom deserve respect.
Nice.
And that is something like that. And that is I think it's a really good definition, also because it sort of it shortcuts these different definitions that are both a little bit too fluffy and a little bit too specific, like saying everything is animate, which is how some define animism, which is I don't think it's a good
But it's also
definition.
not, like, coming back to the Ojibwe, it's not quite right, because
No,
the way Graham Harvey says it is there are persons in the world, only some of whom are humans, is the right way of saying it. Because Halliwell asked his Ojibwe friends, like, so are all stones persons? And they're like, no, what are you, an idiot? Like, some of them are,
exactly.
and that's
Yeah,
in Graham Harvey's definition. It's like there are
yeah,
persons in the world that it doesn't.
yeah,
He's not making universal claims like all stones are people. That's not
yeah.
it.
No, no. And I think it's a really, really, really important point when you're talking about animism. Like when I was doing my education, I remember my professor at some point, he referenced another scholar who had come home from his fieldwork among the Maasai. And then he was listening again to his recording of an interview where a Maasai man had tried to explain this useless Swedish dude, white dude, how stuff actually worked. And he discovered that the causality in what the Maasai had said was inverted from what he had heard originally. He had heard the Maasai say, we do these and these rituals because we believe this and this. And when he listened to properly to the syntax of the sentence, it appeared that what he actually said was, we do these and these rituals, and therefore we believe this and this and this. The beliefs, or what the European mind would perceive as the belief, you say the persons, the presence, the subjectivity, is resulting out of the ritual more than the other way around.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, this is a weird one for the European mind to wrap its Eurocentric head around, right? So, but it ties up, I think, with Harvey's discussion with this old Ojibwe man who said, no, not all stones are persons, but some are. That there's personhood, that personhood and subjectivity is realized through our engagement with it.
Yep.
Now, there are peoples in the world who are totally explicit about that. The West African and Afro-Brazilian religions that I've studied quite a lot, they are completely upfront about this. You know, you speak to West Africans and you ask them, and I've done this a couple of times, you ask them, how does it work, that whole thing about spirits? And they will say pretty much the same thing. They'll say, okay, you take an object, something that's standing on your table, a cup, and you put it under a table, you start worshiping it. And then a spirit will start becoming immanent to that object. And this is not like religiously educated persons, just like stuff that you'll get from any guy on the street. And I've tried this several times in West Africa. And the amazing thing about this is that this is a constructive epistemology of personhood. That is completely common knowledge. Anybody on the street will tell you that other than human subjectivity actually is partly a result of human ritual action, or create or manifested made real through human ritual action. And that I think that's a really important part when we're talking about animism and how do we define it. I think the immanence of subjectivity to action is a really important point. That and this is also where everything is animate. That's sort of it's a modernist statement to begin with. It's kind of this universalizing idea about how the world is probably thought to that work inside some other people's mind. But rather that subjectivity, if the statement was rather that subjectivity manifests through human relating or something like that, then that would also include the fact that some stones are not persons at all, but some certainly are, and they most certainly do become through our relation to it. And these active relations and as ways of actualizing subjectivity, you also find that in European traditions. I read a story about a man who he was on his way home from whatever late at night, and then he passed by a kind of a stone fence on the heath, and there was a little kind of little people or under subterranean spirit that was sitting on that one, and he had a chat with the spirit and said, "You feel like coming home and living with us?" And the spirit said, "Yeah, that's cool. Thank you for the invitation." Spirit joined him home to the farm, and then becomes another kind of spirit. It is individuated in the animist lingo, right? So it is realized as a patron spirit of that farm, and everything goes fine. At some point, relation breaks down. The humans mistreat the spirit in some way. Spirit leaves again, and then all the cows die, and the fields grow barren, and so on and so forth. Right? This is a story about that thing happening. A potentially subjective stone becoming realized through human relating with it, and that calling realizing subjectivity into human reality in that way. I hope that wasn't too muddled
No,
up.
I loved it. Yeah, no, I loved it. I'll tell you a couple of things, right? So that's one European example. I want to say something contentious. I don't get your opinion on it. So when Tyler said that animism was kind of like the primitive baseline, dare I say, original cosmology of mankind, I think he was probably right that it is the original cosmology of mankind, and thus is in fact universally attested. I just hold it in high regard. I don't think it's primitive or childlike, right? Because that's one example from Europe. But if we see it in Judeo-Christian experience in the negative, with the constant exhortations against graven images and graven idols, and the fear of priesthoods and emperors at the possibility, like, please stop doing this. It's one, the fact that they have to keep saying, please stop doing this, means that humans keep doing it. It's it's a thing we do. We relate to spirits, right? But also there's that awareness that there's a reality to it that is dangerous. In that case, dangerous to power. But that please everyone stop building graven images. Why do we do that? That's that kind of relating in. I don't actually mind saying the whole universe is alive. I just don't think that tells you anything. That's like saying the whole universe is dead. It doesn't really. Sure, the whole thing might be alive, but that doesn't make everything a person. And I think there's something about people when we talk about this, and the next bit is going to be a little bit on the ontological turn and how Nordic animism works in the sense of what you're doing, which I love and really resonate with, is actually taking both experiential animism, but theoretical, like animism as a discursive frame to look at things like Nordic history and Nordic cosmology and so on, because that's what I do, but not for the Nordics. That's a really powerful thing. But for that to hold, not for it to hold, what I'm trying to say is, I really resonate with Eduardo Veras de Castro and all that kind of perspectivism stuff. It's just life-changing when you encounter it. And what's important, and that's in his work, is that an Amazonian frame in an academic sense is universal. Like he says, this is the America's contribution to worldwide academic thought. So you're not pretending to be an Amazonian by using it or anything, right? And but more importantly, because that is true, but more importantly, when we do situate ourselves in that framework and see what happens when we experience our landscapes with it, it is a recovery that we had something like that. We actually, we find that in our historical records, we find that in our stories, we find that there is a universality, an animist universality to human behavior, I think. I know that's a contentious statement, but I think humans, coming back to the kids thing, I think we have it ruined out of us. I think we're born with it. But that's just what do you think to that? And then we'll
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. There is something universal to animism, and this has also been mocked in scholarship. You have guys like Latour who asks basically, have we ever been modern? Correct. Have we ever actually not been animist? My position on that would be that I think we have, in the sense that we are not acting on, and animism is very much it's a system of doing, of acting, more than a system of thinking about. And I think that Latour's question is a little bit too much inside the thinking about we actually changed out of the acting.
Yeah.
We don't act as animists. We might talk about climate crisis and pandemics as if they are intentional persons in our newspapers, but we don't act towards them in that way. And that's a quite important thing. But we also see our fundamental drive towards these animist ways of relating in the world. For instance, in conspiracy theories, that I feel conspiracy theories are sort of animism out of place almost. It's kind of a dysfunctional way of creating mythology, because from an animist perspective, you'd want to read the COVID pandemic as a being, as an intentional being that can be placated, that can feel relation to, as some people are indeed doing. They are actually relating a corona goddess in India and some places like that. But when modernity prevents us from creating this action-based relation to this thing that's happening, then we still, it's as if there's a drive towards reading intention into that thing, and that's and then that becomes ideas of
I would describe that a bit differently. I like what you're saying, but I think absolutely it's modernity. But I think this comes back to the universality of animism, right? Which is we know there's agency in the world. We experience that outside the human. We don't have language for it. And modernity is no, there isn't.
Yeah.
and that's I think you get a lot of the more lurid. You certainly get projections with QAnon and whatever, but you get this sort of lurid, we don't have a framework to understand, which I like this about posthumanism. We don't have a good framework to understand that humans aren't the only things operating in the cosmos. And we're sort of forced into, yes, in fact, we are. And that disjunction makes people think that Trump is secretly still president or something.
Yeah.
But I agree completely that the diagnosis is on modernity being too small and no longer appropriate. Not that it ever was, but like it's at breaking point now. It's at breaking point in its capacity to account for agency in the cosmos. I would say that differently, because also as an historian, conspiracies are everywhere. So it's the other side of it where they actually do happen, but the ones you're referring to are like Trump is still president secretly, that kind of stuff, where it's a dysfunction of worldview versus agency, I think.
Also conspiracy theories are everywhere. The Romans had conspiracy theories, and it was a conspiracy theory that caused the expulsion of the Jews from England and so on. Conspiracy theories are there, but I think they are proliferation with modernity is really worth noting. And
totally.
if you look at how West Africans in the 19th century explained the smallpox epidemics, and why weren't there more conspiracy theories there? I mean, you had actual differently looking, very, very, very aggressive alien humans landing on gigantic vessels in their community, wreaking havoc beyond belief, and then they brought smallpox. Why weren't they saying, well, maybe they were also saying that this is a weapon that white people, sat and made in some laboratories and something like that, but it seemed to have not been the main thread of their thing.
And yet in the Americas, that is what happened. In the Americas, in Colombia, when smallpox arrived, it was perceived to be a punishment. That is arguably a conspiracy theory, that their gods were displeased that they had moved out of relation with him, and they started sacrificing their own kids to stop this happen. So it does, like, you can find it. I mean more just from a student of modern history perspective, that we find out decades later that the things that are official reality turn out to not be. Not that Trump is still secretly president stuff, but
come on.
Yeah, well, but I think that this is what I find so exciting about the discourse around animism and its arrival now. If it doesn't show up now, Well, it's almost like it's unstoppable, because I think you're correct in diagnosing the proliferation of that is a response to the fact that the worldview that we've inherited is not just not up for the task. It's in the process. It's in its last few, possibly months, but like it's last few moments of any utility at all, and there's an opportunity to see what comes back, or what comes through afterwards. And I do, and it's a good example of using animism to talk about animism, right? Because we're talking about the tension between not being able to understand agency and so on, because we just don't have the language for it, where we might find it elsewhere.
And it's a way of using traditional knowledge to create a critical perspective on the state of current affairs. I mean, like mythology, for instance. I think mythologies are tools for creating relation. A little bit harking back to the idea of different mythologies of what an Orisha deity actually is. So it's tools for creating relation. Well, what we're seeing now is rampant dysfunctional mythology weaving somehow, primarily on the internet. And I think part of the reason that it's so dysfunctional is that the internet, which is supposed to be so extremely relational, in fact have ended up being very non-relational, because we're all encased in these mirror cabinets, and that damages all of us. It damages us on the left. Me, I'm on the left wing. In our way of thinking about things, it suddenly makes right-wingers more bigoted, and so on and so forth. And the relation making that would enable us make communities capable of addressing the hyper complex problems that the world is facing, those relationships are not available on the internet. So you have these mirror cabinet mythologies that are just running. I was quite inspired by the Australian author Tyson Yunkaporta. I also had a bit of contact with him. I don't know if you know his
oh no, I've been talking about his stuff for years. Well, for a year and a half now since the book came out. I'm actually going to head up to Melbourne in a bit. So anyway,
if you meet him, then you pass my greetings. But he talks about this thing about the complex relations that makes human communities capable of addressing very complex problems. And he takes an indigenous scholarship perspective on that. I think it's a really awesome perspective also on why our present situation is dysfunctional.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so that's funny enough, because it's in the book that I just finished. And it's in the, I don't even like the word managing because it's too utilitarian. In the navigating complexity, animist modes of thought are superior, and this comes back to that original kind of like Enlightenment premise that we can derive truths from breaking things down to the smallest parts, right? And as the universe, that was never going to work, but now the universe is far too complicated, and we don't have a language of complexity because our language of truth making is in the wrong direction for it. And you find in indigenous thought that in fact they do, and they have a language of complexity that allows Aboriginal Australia, is a perfect example, to manage this country as an estate for 50,000 years. That's pretty good. That we should be listening to that. And I mean, the permaculture world. So Alan Savory, who invented the sort of regenerative use of livestock as a system, he didn't invent it, he'd learned it in Africa. But like his holistic management framework, he says that humans are incapable of, the world is too complex for humans to manage correctly. And I that's not right. Like he's most of the way there. Like his holistic framework is almost like a replica of certain kinds of indigenous thought that allow for the management of complexity. But I just want him to get that one step further and go, actually, no, there are human frameworks that can manage complexity. It's just they're not ones that you're going to find in a managerial system. Because I think Sand Talk is one of the most important books of the last few years, and I'm just going through my head of different Aboriginal writers that I know over the last few decades And I think it's up there with like David Moaljale. I think it's just an incredible effort. And how I described it in my book is it's not just a characterization of indigenous thinking, it is characterizing it in a way that centers indigenous thinking. So he's an academic, but the book isn't. And the book doesn't conform to the frameworks of how you write an academic book, because it's not, it's actually about the validity of other epistemology. So I think it's a genius work.
No, I fully agree. And it's also, actually, that's a little bit what I'm also trying to do. Like I'm trying to get at Nordic animism from the starting point of being an academic and having thought these thoughts from an academic position, but I'm trying to get out of it. I'm trying to get my head out of my arse. You know, I mean, you need to, if the point is relating.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like, if the point is relating, then you can't dig yourself into ontological turn babbling. You just cannot, because that is not relational.
No.
And it's basically that simple. And you need to at least try to communicate out of difficult ways of thinking and talking and so on. And I think it's a great exercise, and I'm really learning a lot from it. Trying to popularize and make stuff like properly available. I think, I'm trying to do it, and still definitely in a learning process with it.
Well, yeah, I think it's excellent, because I think you're right. Well, I know you're right, but like, it can't be a disembodied exercise. Like going back to De Castro, talking about theory and practice is itself a theory that comes out of a practice, right? So you cannot just think the correct thoughts in an academic context. One, because animism implies that's impossible, because relationality incorporates thoughts. Some thoughts are beings. So it's not, you can't just do it in a library. It has to be done in an embodied sense. It has to be in relating, and that's what I really like about your videos, is that it's patently relating, and it, even if it, I don't want to say just, but to be on country for some of those discussions is crucial, right? That's how it's done. Like, and because otherwise, if you're going to assert the validity of place spirits, you can't do that from a library in another country.
No. And I think that when we are, like, as Eurodescendants, trying to think ourselves into animist relation, or trying to bring ourselves into animist relation, I think a certain playfulness actually is a necessity. We need a certain playfulness, because we can't just invent out of whole cloth, like the relation system of a complexity and wisdom, as those elders that Juncker Porter is referencing in his book there. You know, that's not something that you can just make up. Like, and so one option is playfulness, for instance, and being a little bit like, for instance, I started a cultural event in Denmark where we basically it took its starting point in my work on seasonal animism around the year, to kind of reinvent Yule Christmas animism in a very contemporary sense. Now, this was a good thing to do, because it has carnivalesque aspects to it. It's very carnivalesque to begin with, and that means that you can sort of you can say, okay, this is about having fun, wearing masks, getting drunk, and behaving sexually in the streets. And that is in some way it's core in this ritual, because it's carnivalesque, right? So that is a way of being playful with it, and saying, okay, this is a way where we can do something concrete. The book I did, about seasonal animism, is also, I'm sort of trying to reach out and say, okay, this shouldn't really be writing, it should be something you do, and try to kind of seeded as much as I can into people's normal life, so I'm very much like trying to and doing these things. I think there's also really risks also putting me outside academia, because I'm putting myself so much in a kind of an neo-paganist hippie space that I'm bound to become a little bit kind of almost suspect in academic service. But I have to do it because it has to become realized. It has to become realized in action. And in order for that to happen, then it also needs to communicate with stuff like common sense ideas, and romanticisms. There are kind of popular ways of thinking that I can't just kind of go, oh, okay, well, I'm not soiling my kind of spherical academic thinking with these things. I have to sort of, get a little bit, get my hands dirty a little bit and work with those things. And yeah, so, and I think in order to bring ourselves out of the thinking, talking space, we probably need to do stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
you're just gonna have, I mean, I know you're doing it. It is a brave thing to do. If we need and we need an epistemology for a universe that's forming rather than formed, to use like Tim Ingold, then it is going to be, it will look incomplete in the old epistemology. So what you were talking about with the seasonal book, like I don't even really want this to be a book. I want it to be like, go and do these things, because it's the book can't contain it, because we're moving to a new epistemology. And you're just going to have to do that in an academic setting until a sufficient relational web forms amongst those spirits and places and thoughts and colleagues and so on, and move it in a critical mass way. Because I appreciate there's an element of like, there's a leap involved, because if this is how you're going to, do truth validation, if this is how you're going to learn things, then you have to do it that way. You can't say that's how to do it, but do it the other way. It's wild times. Like I actually think I'm more bullish about that kind of exciting. I'm more bullish about academia's ontological turn, which is essential, and I don't think most people are going to make it. I'm not necessarily bullish about academia in the next decade or so, but out of it is going to come stuff like this, I think.
Yeah, totally.
All right, so we spoke around it and we kind of talked about different bits of the project, but like, give us Nordic animism as like the last topic area. What actually is it, and I don't want to say what are you hoping to achieve, because again, that's not
save the world.
Yeah, well, there you go. That was easy. But like, it's just in the doing, right? So a friend of mine, Ruth, down here, she's just Aboriginal Australian, and she runs this most amazing thing that she's manifested called the Longhouse, which is sort of like an Aboriginal community center, but not, because it does other kind of healing modalities, and we do book launches there, and it's all this sort of thing. And whenever you ask her, like, what do you want to do with this? Like, why did you do this? She's like, I'm just like, it's not like I just work here. It's I'm allowing this thing, I'm participating in this being called the Longhouse becoming what it's going to become, right? And that's more of the framework. So when I say, what do you hope to achieve with Nordic animism, I don't mean that I'm gonna like have a list here, but like, see how you respond to that question anyway. What do you hope to achieve?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole thing grew rather organically, and was inspired by slightly perhaps surprising sources, like, for instance, these Afro-Brazilians, the way that they create counter-modernity. It's not very visible. I refer to it a lot, but it's not very visible in how deep they're thinking about how to actually build alternate spaces to modernity is really in the Nordic animism way of thinking. And I think that what I now, yeah, let me say it like this. What they do in, for instance, the Orisha religions that come from West Africa, they build safeguarded spaces for alternate ontologies, non-modern, imminent, alternate ontologies. They do this very, very successfully. They do this so successfully that, for instance, there are Native Americans in Brazil who are actually adopting Afro-Brazilian ritual structures in order to re-indigenize themselves and reclaim their own ancestrality. Now, what I would like to achieve, I think, well, this could be one way of phrasing it, would be to create safeguarded space from which an alternate counter-modern ontology, an animist ontology, can be spoken towards majority populations.
Love it.
Because the facts are that there are quite a lot of us who are not Aboriginal Australians or Yupik, indigenous First Nations, and so on. There's a lot of us, but we all we have the same animisms. We have the same traditional knowledge in our heritage. We just didn't start looking at our heritage in that way yet. I mean, I'm still like continuously flabbergasted that it seems that I'm the first cultural scholar, perhaps, who are actually looking at stuff like folklore and pre-Christian religion from the perspective of kind of an traditional knowledge, indigenous study sort of inflected way of looking at our Euro-descendant culture, right? And if I could create a space that for developing perhaps the tools to create safeguarded spaces, then I think that would be probably my objective.
I like it. And it's, I especially like that you reference the West African origin of this process or this framework, because it reminds me, unsurprisingly, because that's where he got it from, Bayo Komolafe's idea of making sanctuary. It's that it's sort of articulating this West African technology for counter modernity. I like that, but it is. It's the there are techniques that we can draw inspiration from. And this is Tyson Yunkaporta, right? Products of thought versus ways of thinking. There are ways of thinking we can draw inspiration from that allow for that. And again, this is why I remain an animist, because the fact that that works, that will work in West Africa, that will work in Rio, that will work in Denmark, I think actually says something about reality. I think the fact that you can create, I want to use like realm or place rather than space because it's not the right word, but the fact that you can world these sanctuaries so that they can extend relation, the fact that that works, I think is itself metaphysically interesting. But I like how you articulated it.
Yeah, I think like when we talk about both Adebayo Komolafe and West Africa, these things, like the history of racism means that the Yoruba people is not really being kind of seen as one of the great contributing cultures to the world on the line of the Romans, the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, the Egyptians, and so on. But in fact, I mean, I think that the ways that enslaved the descendants of enslaved Africans in the Americas, the ways that they are coping with modernity, I think that is some of the most powerful stuff in the world, basically. And that it's so effective, and it's so inclusive, and it's so dynamic and vital, while being so powerfully inherently traditional. It's exactly like Komolafe says, it's not imaging a distant past of an ideal situation. Sometimes these aspects also exist in there, and there are also aspects of nationalism and so on. But as a whole, or at least the aspects that I've been looking at, you see very much the kind of a transatlantic, very Creole yet very traditional coping with modernity for the purpose of creating imminent technologies. And I think that because I have so much of my inspiration from these people, this is also part of the reason that I think that, I think all you guys who are diaspora descendants, in a sense, I think that I can't really articulate exactly, but I almost think that some of the keystones in the healing will probably come from you guys. Like, I'm culturally unambiguous. I'm 100% Danish, and my ancestors didn't move. So, but this is not actually, that's the exception. Most people, also indigenous peoples, are diaspora, displaced, and so on. And these enslaved Africans, they reacted to the most harsh oppression of modernity that any humans have ever faced, and they articulated their cultural heritage in a response to that. And I think this is like part of what will form the answer in the age that we're coming to. I think that the Yoruba, for their contribution to cultural history, will probably be remembered like the Greeks in some centuries.
Yeah, I agree. And it's, I know why you struggle to articulate it, because we're both being careful, and neither of us think this, and it's dumb, but we're both being careful to, how to say this? I think you're right about Yoruba thought. I think it will be like Greek philosophy. I think the same thing, although it's a little bit more synthetic because it has to have been synthesized. I think the same thing with Amazonian thought, right? Like, I think perspectivism is a contribution to the world of thought, right? Like, Plato or Socrates or something, right? And I think the same with Yoruba thought. And so I agree that whatever the next few centuries, assuming we get a couple more centuries or however long, we get, it's touch and go. There needs to be, we need to be able to say, like, it's something, I'll do it backwards. So I don't know if you know who Gary Luckman is. He's an author and a friend of mine. And when he was down here giving a talk about, he likes European thinkers, and he came to Australia. The Anthroposophical Society flew him out, and he's giving talks about different people in the history of European theory of mind, Owen Barfield, and all this kind of stuff. Really great. And someone puts their hand up in the at the end, and is saying, like, well, he starts talking about Indian thought and different Indian sages and their understanding of consciousness. And Gary's like, that's amazing. I love thought in general, but I'm just like, I really resonate with these few European thinkers, and that's what I've sort of studied and devoted to. And I just like the way he said that confidently, because I really resonate with Amazonian thought. And I don't think I'm Amazonian or anything. It's like, I love all these amazing frameworks around the world, but I like Amazonian thought. I like Aboriginal thought. And this is kind of what you're getting at. The answer is, how do we, and it is part of our healing as well as, and I don't mean a healing of historic sufferings, but it is part of the planet's healing that we allow these ideas to share and express on a playing field where they are accepted for what they are, right? Because the knee-jerk reaction or the negative comments on YouTube will be like, you're appropriating Yoruba culture. And I'm like, I think I'm doing the opposite, but I am very cautious of that. And I don't know how else to do it other than say, I like this thought. I think it has a profound contribution to make to the world of thought. Is that how we do it, Rune? Like, what else do we need to do? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think that well, first of all, it's fundamentally a racist structure that means that Yoruba thought Amazonian thought
Has to
and Asian thought is not included in, for instance, the academy. I'm not saying the guy you spoke about was a racist. I think it's cool.
No.
With certain fingers and so on. But the thing is that in contemporary identity politics, I think contemporary identity politics needs to be very aware how we reproduce racist and national essentialist ideas, particularly when we're talking about cultural appropriation, because and that's not because cultural appropriation is a thing. It's totally a thing, and it should totally be criticized, and it should be. There are many cases where it's really, really important that it's criticized aggressively, and the very aggressive criticisms of cultural appropriation that we have had historically in the last 20 years, they've had a really, really positive effect. When you look at, for instance, new productions of Walt Disney and so on, they are very culturally sensitive. Anyway, however, we need to be aware of the ways that cultural appropriation criticisms reproduce these national essentialisms that actually reinforce the exclusions of non-white voices in the global debates. Like one example could be that you and I, we're allowed to be inspired by Sigmund Freud and Jung. So is a Nigerian or an Afro-Cuban, and the reason is the power distribution. However, as soon as we as European start to be inspired by Afro-Cuban or Yoruba knowledge, then we are flowing sort of with the grain of power in the power symmetry, in the racial power symmetry, and then it becomes illegitimate from the point of view of cultural appropriation criticism. Now, the problem with that is that it actually enforces the seclusion, almost the exotifying of the Yoruba and the Afro-Cuban knowledge systems that are amazing contributions to how we negotiate our relation to modernity today. Amazing contributions for whom these cultures will be remembered for centuries, that will inscribe these cultures in the in the flow of global culture, like it has happened with the Greeks and the Mesopotamians and so on. And so I sometimes I almost sense that there is it's almost like a commodifying of those cultural expressions that wants to seclude them to specific culturalized identity essences, that they have to stay in those spaces. It's almost a stigmatization. And if you go and ask a transatlantic Orisha such as Ogun where he would like to go, where he would like to be, and by who he would be like to be manifested, I don't think he would have a problem being manifested by white Australians. But there's even, I think there's also, we even risk reducing the agency of the human subjectivities by implementing this this identitarian nationalist essentialisms.
Absolutely.
So I think it's really,
not even asserting the reality of spirit. It's just mental. Go on.
Exactly. Which is hyper Eurocentric. It's aggressive Eurocentric. But I think that in our process of dealing with whiteness, dealing with power symmetries, dealing with nationalisms, dealing with modernity, asking the questions that I'm asking now, they must be part of inscribing these or opening doors for these non-white cultures to gain the voice that they legitimately should have in cultural history. Now there's also the problem, of course, of the way that the internet works, that it's always there's tendency towards it being most aggressive and most condemning voices that are dominating, and I sense that sometimes happening, particularly when we're talking identity politics. But I think the transportation of, or the universal adaptation of North American identity politics risks stigmatizing the access of those cultures to the global scenes and global flows of thought.
Yeah.
I hope that wasn't too controversial what I just said.
No, I don't think so.
I'll be cancelled.
Yeah. Oh, well, you develop lifelong immunity to it. It reminds me, so the other side of it is not just the erasure of agency of the spirit world, which is, again, as you say, a reinforcement of like the materialist-naturalist idea that would make the whole project of trying to learn from others pointless anyway, because you already have the answer. But in every single case I can find, because I've gone through it for the book I just finished. So in the 80s in Australia, there was a really important part of the kind of Aboriginal land rights movement where these elders, particularly from Northwest Australia, stood up and started talking about ideas like dadiri, which is deep listening. And David Mowal-Jarlai talked about two-way thinking. And the whole time they're saying, like, we have been trying to give you this the whole time. You don't have it for whatever reason. You don't have deep listening. You don't have two-way thinking. These are these profoundly transformative Aboriginal originating spells, frameworks, whatever you want for them. And they've been trying to give them, like, and we're on the other side of it going like, nope, I don't want to appropriate that. I'm like, oh my God, take it. The world is at risk. You guys need to realize, you guys need to realize what you're doing, And so there's the denial of agency. And so I don't know if you know who Mark Fisher was, English academic. And he sort of had this notion of the vampire's castle. But basically the idea is that where we are in capitalism, it is so robust that it will automatically contain its opposition. So if you look at identitarianism and de-angeloism, it's literally that. Like it looks like it's trying to break out of these structures, but it's sort of instantly absorbed back into the mechanics of how the whole thing works. And that's the real, like we need like a barrel roll out into a completely, I don't want to say different or separate or whatever, but we need to be thinking from an animist or relational mode, because the non-animist mode will automatically contain its opposition and reify. And I like that idea when you see the rise of, as you say, like the world conquering of North American identitarianism. It is actually the system's own antibodies. Like it's actually making sure that nothing gets out. Yeah. It's a good read.
And I mean, I've become increasingly concerned about some of the forms that have been taking, because I start seeing it now. I'm very adverse to, for instance, the alt-right movements, racism, and nationalism. I have a kind of a personal beef with nationalism, particularly, and I've been starting to sort of see tendencies where it is as if exactly the same dynamics seem to be driving the outright nationalisms, but also the most hardcore identity politics, culturalizing being one example that you say, and signal, what is sometimes called, well, in Danish it's called signal politics, that it's much more important for, say, alt-right white Americans, that there's a old white asshole sitting in presidency saying asshole things. It's much more important than actually having healthcare. So it's symbolism over reality. And you could say the same from the point of view of identitarians. Oh, if we could just have a charming, well-spoken, charismatic, non-white person sitting in president, then we're okay with him pressing the buttons on drone and assassination programs and so on. It's almost as if there are these similarities in the ways of navigating actual human realities, and I've started to become suspicious of them. And also there's similar patterns of judgmentalism. There's similar patterns of othering. As you mentioned, the relation to animism actually is also similar. The idea that there are persons in the world. No. there's no
Nothing.
such thing
There's
as
nothing.
Odin or
Yeah.
Ogum. There's only there's only symbols of identities.
Yeah.
And that's also exactly the same position. And,
Yeah.
and so I'm in sort of, and I think that in order to, yes, heal the world, then we need then kind, progressive, uncompromisingly anti-racist, uncompromisingly indigenous empowerment, uncompromising sexual gender inclusion, and so on. Positions need to be made from positions that start to question the identitarianism.
And those that sounds like a counter-modernity to me. And so those positions come from the sanctuaries we were talking about. Like, this is why bio changed my life, with like post-activism and what do we do? What do we do when doing is fraught? Like, when doing is part of the problem, what do we do? And the answer is this rituals of counter-modernity and sanctuary making and so on, because you cannot get into the vampire's castle because you can't get out. Like, you're trapped. It doesn't, the game isn't there. And so we are, and it's not even like we're left with, it's, I really do think this will be the reflourishing of the world, is a decentralized sanctuary making, blooming of counter-modernities.
Yes. Unfortunately, I haven't started properly familiarizing myself with Bio's writings, but from what I've seen of what he says, I just think it is so spot on.
Yeah.
Some of it, like, so spot on, and he obviously comes to it from the Yoruba angle, and I have as an outsider looked at the Afro-Brazilian Yoruba tradition. So I'm really hoping to meet him one day.
Yeah, nice.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, speaking of people I hope to meet you one day when travel can happen and so on. We've had a fucking great chat. But Rune,
Yes.
tell people, I mean, people who listen to the show are probably really vibing on this, but where can they go to find out more about you and what you got going on and all that kind of stuff?
You find me under the name Nordic Animism, and you just search on that on YouTube, Instagram, and Google. I have a homepage and a couple of different platforms I'm trying to use. That's where you find me.
Nice one. All right, well, great chat. Love what you're doing. Love the videos. Definitely keep them up. They're lots of fun.
Thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
No, anytime, definitely. All right, have a good one.
You too.